Hi guys, chapter 10 of Where the Red Fern Grows. Hope you've been enjoying the story. I know I have. Um, we'll see what happens next. Mama made me a cap out of my first coon hide. I was as proud of it as Papa would have been if someone had given him a dozen Missouri mules. Mama said afterwards that she wished she hadn't made it for me because, in some way, wearing that cap must have affected my mind. I went coon crazy. I was out after the ringtails every night. About the only time I didn't go hunting was when the weather was bad, and even then Mama all but had to hog tie me in. What wonderful nights they were, running like a deer through the thick timber of the bottoms, tearing my way through the stands of wild cane, climbing over drifts and jumping logs, running, screaming, and yelling, "Woo-wee! Get 'em, boy, get 'em!" following the voices of my little hounds. It wasn't too hard for a smart old coon to fool old Dan, but there were none that prowled the river banks that could fool my little Ann. As Grandpa had predicted, the price of coonskins jumped sky high. A good-sized hide was worth from $4 to $10, depending on the grade and the quality. I kept the side of our smokehouse plastered with hides. Of course, I would spread them out a little to cover more space. I always stretched them on the side facing the road, never on the back side. I wanted everyone in the country to see them. The money earned from my furs was turned over to my father. I didn't care about it. I had what I wanted, my dogs. I supposed that Papa was saving it for something because I never did see anything new turn up around our home, but like any young boy, I wasn't bothered by it and asked no questions. My whole life was wrapped up in my dogs. Everywhere I went, they went along. There was only one place I didn't want them to go with me, and that was to Grandpa's store. Other dogs were always there, and it seemed as if all they wanted to do was jump on old Dan. It got so about the only time I went to see my grandfather was when I had a bundle of fur to take to the store. This was always a problem. In every way I could, I would try to slip away from my dogs. Sometimes I swore that they could read my mind. It made no difference what I tried. I couldn't fool them. One night I was sure I had outsmarted them. The day before I was going to make one of my trips, I took my furs out of the barn and hid them. The next morning I hung around the house for a while, then nonchalantly whistled my way out to the barn. I climbed up in the loft and peeked through a crack. I could see them lying in front of their doghouse. They weren't even looking my way. Taking my furs, I sneaked out through a back door, and walking like a tomcat, I made it to the timber. I climbed all the dogwood tree. I climbed a small dogwood tree and looked back. They were still there and didn't seem to know that I had gone. Feeling just about as smart as Sherlock Holmes, I headed for the store. I was walking along, singing my lungs out, when all of a sudden they came tearing out of the underbrush, wiggling and twisting, tickled to death to be with me. At first I was mad, but one look at dancing little Ann and it was all forgiven. I sat down on a bundle of fur and laughed till I hurt all over. I could scold them a little, but I could no more have whipped one of them than I could have kissed a girl. After all, a boy just doesn't whip his dogs. Grandpa always counted my furs carefully and marked something down on a piece of paper. I'd never seen him do this with other hunters, and it got the best of my curiosity. One day while he was writing, I asked him, "Why do you do that, Grandpa?" He looked me over with his glasses and said kind of sharp, "Never mind, I have my reasons." When Grandpa talked to me like that, I didn't push any further. Besides, it didn't make any difference to me if he marked on every single piece of paper in the store. I always managed to make my trips on Saturdays, as that was Coon Hunters Day. I didn't have to stand around in the outside of the circle anymore and listen to the coon hunters. I'd get right up in the middle and say my piece with the best of them. I didn't have to tell any whoppers, for some of the things my dogs did were almost unbelievable anyhow. Oh, I guess I did make things a little bigger than they actually were, but I never did figure a coon hunter told honest-to-goodness lies. He just kind of stretched things a little. I could hold those coon hunters spellbound with some of my hunting tales. Grandpa would never say anything while I was telling my stories. He just puttered around the store with a silly little grin on his face. Once in a while I got too far off the beaten path, he would come around and cram a bar of soap in my pocket. My face would get all red, and I'd cut my story short, fly out the door, and head for home. The coon hunters were always kidding me about my dogs. Some of the remarks I heard made me fighting mad. I never saw hounds so small, but I guess they are hounds. At least they look like it. I don't believe little Ann is half as smart as he says she is. She's so little those old coons think she's a rabbit. I bet she sneaks right up on them before they realize she's a dog. Some of these nights a big old coon is going to carry her off to his den and raised some little coon puppies. I always took their kidding with a smile on my face, but it made my blood boil like the water in Mama's tea kettle. I had one way of shutting them up. "Let's go in the store," I'd say, "and see who has the most hides in there." It was true that my dogs were small, especially the lamb. She could walk under an ordinary hound. In fact, she was a regular midget. If it had not been for her long ears, no one would have even guessed she was a hound. Her actions weren't those of a hunting hound. She was constantly playing. She would play with our chickens and our young calves with a piece of paper or a corn cob. What my little girl lacked in size, she made up for in sweetness. She could make friends with a tomcat. Old Dan was just the opposite. He strutted around like a belligerent and tough with a belligerent and tough attitude. Although he wasn't a tall dog, he was heavy. His body was long and his chest broad and thick. His legs were short, big, and solid. The muscles in his body were hard and knotty. When he walked, they would twist and jerk under his skin. He was a friendly dog. There were no strangers to him. He loved everyone. Yet he was a strange dog. He would not hunt with another hound, other than Little Ann, or another hunter, not even my father. The strangest thing about old Dan was that he would not hunt, even with me, unless Little Ann was with him. I found this out the first night I tried it. Little Ann had cut the pad of her right foot on a sharp, jagged flint rock. It was a nasty cut. I made her a little boot of leather and put it on her wounded foot. To keep her from following me, I locked her in the corn crib. 2 nights later, I decided to take old Dan hunting for a while. He followed me down to the river bottoms and disappeared into the thick timber. I waited and waited for him to strike a trail. Nothing happened. After about 2 hours, I called to him. He didn't come. I called and called. Disgusted, I gave up and went home. Coming up through the barn lot, I saw him rolled up in a ball on the ground right in front of the corn crib. I immediately understood. I walked over and opened the door. He jumped up in the crib, smelled Little Ann's foot, twisted around in the shucks, and lay down by her side. As he looked at me, I read this message in his friendly gray eyes. You could have done this a long time ago. I never did know if Little Ann would hunt by herself or not. I'm sure she would have, for she was smart and an understanding dog, but I never did try to find out. Little Ann was my sister's pet. They rubbed and scratched and petted her. They would take her down to the creek and give her baths. She loved it all. If Mama wanted a chicken caught, she would call Little Ann. She would run the chicken down and hold it with her paws until Mama came. Not one feather would be harmed. Mama tried old Dan out once. Before she got the chicken, there wasn't much left but the feathers. By some strange twist of nature, Little Ann was destined to go through life without being a mother. Perhaps it was because she was stunted in growth, or maybe because she was the runt of her large litter. That may have had something to do with it. During the first season, November through February, I was given complete freedom from work. Many times when I came home, the sun was high in the sky. After each hunt, I always took care of my dogs. The flint rocks and sawbriars were hard on their feet. With a bottle of peroxide and a can of salve, I would doctor their wounds. I never knew what to expect from old Dan. I never saw a coonhound so determined, or one that could get into so many predicaments. More than one time, it would have been the death of him if it hadn't been for smart Little Ann. One night, not long after I had entered the bottoms, my dogs struck the trail of an old boar coon. He was a smart old fellow and had a sack full of tricks. He crossed the river time after time, finally swimming to the middle and staying in the swift current. He swam downstream. Knowing he would have to come out somewhere, my dogs split up. Old Dan took the right side and Little Ann worked the other. I came out of the bottoms onto a gravel bar and stood and watched them in the moonlight. Little Ann worked downriver. Then she came up. I saw her when she passed me going up the bank, sniffing and searching for the trail. She came back to me. I patted her head, scratched her ears, and talked to her. She kept staring across the river to where old Dan was searching for the trail. She waded in and swam across to help him. I knew that the coon had not come out of the river on her side. If he had, she would have found the trail. I walked up a riffle, pulled off my shoes, and waded across. My dogs worked the riverbank up and down. They circled far out to the bottoms. I could hear the loud snuffing of old Dan. He was bewildered and mad. I was getting a thrill from it all. I had never seen them fooled like this. Old Dan gave up on his side, piled into the river, and swam across to the side that Little Ann had worked. I knew that it was useless for him to do that. I was on the point of giving up, calling them to me, and going elsewhere to hunt, when I heard the bawl of Little Ann. I couldn't believe what I heard. She wasn't bawling on a trail. She was sounding the tree bark. I hurried down the bank. There was a loud splash. I saw old Dan swimming back. By this time, Little Ann was really singing a song. In the bright moonlight, I could see old Dan clearly. His powerful front legs were churning the water. Then I saw a sight that makes a hunter's heart swell with pride. Still swimming, old Dan raised his head high out of the water and bawled. He couldn't wait until he had reached the bank to tell little Ann he was coming. From far out of the river, he told her. Reaching the shallows, he plowed out of the river and onto the sandbar. Not even taking time to shake the water from his body, again he raised his head and bawled, and tore out down the bank. In a trot, I followed, whooping to let them know that I was coming. Before I reached the tree, old Dan's deep voice was making the timber shake. The tree was a large birch, standing right on the bank of the river. The swift current had eaten away at the footing, causing it to lean. The lower branches of the tree dangled in the water. I saw how the smart old coon had pulled his trick. Coming in toward the bank from midstream, he had caught the dangling limbs and climbed up. Exhausted from the long swim, he stayed there in the birch, thinking he had outsmarted my dogs. I couldn't understand how little Ann had found him. It was impossible to follow the tree toward the bottoms. It was too much off balance. I did the next best thing. I cut a long elder switch. Unbuckling one of my suspenders, I tied it to the end and climbed the tree. The coon was sitting in the fork of a limb. Taking my switch, I whopped him a good one, and out he came. He sailed right over the river. With a loud splash, he hit the water and swam for the other side. My dogs jumped off the bank after him. They were no match against his expert swimming. On reaching the other bank, he ran downriver. Climbing down out of the tree, I picked up my axe and lantern, trotted to another riffle, and waded across. I could tell by the bawling of my dogs they were close to the coon. He would have to climb a tree or get caught on the ground. All at once their voices stopped. I stood still and waited for them to bawl. Treed. Nothing happened. Thinking the coon had taken to the river again, I waited to give them time to reach the opposite bank. I waited and waited. I could hear nothing. By then I knew he had not crossed the river. I thought perhaps they had caught him on the ground, so I hurried on. I came to a point where a slough of crystal clear water ran into the river. On the other side was a bluff. I could hear one of my dogs over there. As I watched and waited, I heard a dog jump in the water. It was little Ann. She swam across and back to me. Staying with me for just a second, she jumped in the slough and swam back to the other side. I could hear her sniffing and whining. I couldn't figure out where old Dan was. By squatting down and holding the lantern high over my head, I could dimly see the opposite bank. Little Ann was running up and down. I noticed she always stayed in one place of about 25 yards, never leaving that small area. She ran down to the water's edge and stared out into the slough. The horrible thought came that old Dan had drowned. I knew a big coon was capable of drowning a dog in the water by climbing on its head and forcing him under. As fast as I could run, I circled the slough, climbed up and over the bluff, and came down to where little Ann was. She was hysterical, running up and down the bank and whining. I tied my lantern on a long pole, held it out over the water, and looked for old Dan's body. I could see clearly in the clear spring waters, but I couldn't see my dog anywhere. I sat down on the bank, buried my face in my hands, and cried. I was sure he was gone. Several minutes passed, and all that time little Ann had never stopped. Running here and there along the bank, she kept sniffing and whining. I heard when she started digging. I looked around. She was 10 feet from the water's edge. I got up and went over to her. She was digging in a small hole about the size of a big apple. It was the air hole for a muskrat den. I pulled little Ann away from the hole, knelt down, and peered my ear to it. I could hear something and feel a vibration on the ground. It was an eerie sound that seemed to be coming from far away. I listened. Finally, I understood what the noise was. It was the voice of old Dan. Little Ann had opened the hole up big enough with her digging so that his voice could be heard faintly. In some way, he had gotten into that old muskrat den. I knew that down under the bank, in the water, the entrance to the den could be found. Rolling up my sleeve, I tried to find it with my hand. I had no luck. It was too far down. There was only one thing to do. Leaving my axe and lantern, I ran for home. Picking up a long-handled shovel, I hurried back. The sun was high in the sky before I had dug old Dan out. He was a sight to see, nothing but mud from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. I held onto his collar and led him down the river to wash him off. The water there was much warmer than the cold spring water of the slough. After washing him, I turned him loose. Right back to the hole he ran. Little Ann was already digging. I knew the coon was still there. Working together, we dug him out. After the coon was killed, I saw that what had made him so smart. His right front foot was twisted and shriveled. At one time, he must have been caught in a trap and had pulled himself free. He was an old coon. His face was almost white. He was big and heavy and had beautiful fur. Tired, muddy, wet, and hungry, I started for home. I've often wondered how old Dan got into that old muskrat den. Perhaps there was another entrance that I had overlooked. I'll never know. One night, far back in the mountains, in a place called the Cyclone Timber, old Dan really pulled a good one. Many years before my time, a terrible cyclone had ripped its way through the mountains, leaving the scar in the form of fallen timber, twisted and snarled. The path of the cyclone was several miles wide and several miles long. It was a wonderful place to hunt, as it abounded with game. My dogs had struck the trail of a coon for about an hour before. They had really been warming him up. I knew it was about time to take him up a tree, and sure enough, I heard the deep voice of old Dan telling the whole world the coon was up a tree. I was trotting along, going to them, when his voice stopped. I could hear little Ann, but not old Dan. I wondered why, and was a little scared, for I just knew something had happened. Then I heard his voice. It seemed louder than it had before. I felt much better. When I came to the tree, I thought little Ann had treed old Dan. She was sitting on her haunches, staring up and bawling at the tree bark. There, a good 15 feet from the ground, with his hind legs planted firmly in the corner of a big limb, and his front feet against the trunk of the tree, stood old Dan, bawling for all he was worth. Above him, some 8 or 9 feet, was a baby coon. I was glad it was a young one, for if it had been an old one, he would have just jumped out. Old Dan would have followed, and surely he would have broken all of his legs. From where I was standing, I could see it was impossible for old Dan to have climbed the tree. It was dead and more of an old snag than a tree, with limbs that were crooked and twisted. The bark had rotted away and fallen off, leaving the trunk bare and slick as glass. It was a good 10 feet to the first limb. I couldn't figure out how old Dan had climbed that tree. There had to have been a solution somewhere. Walking around to the far side, I saw how he'd accomplished this feat. There in the bottom was a large hole. The old tree was hollow. Stepping back, I looked up and could see another hole, which had been hidden from me because of old Dan's body. He had simply crawled into the hole at the bottom, climbed up the hollow of the tree, and worked his way out on the limb. In some way, he had turned around and reared up, placing his front feet against the trunk. There he was. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't cut the tree down, and I was afraid to climb it for fear that I would scare the coon into jumping out. If he did, old Dan would jump, too, and break his legs. I ran plan after plan around in my mind. None of them would work. I finally came to the conclusion that I had to climb the tree to get a hold of that crazy dog. I blew out my lantern, pulled off my shoes and socks, and started to shimmy up the tree. I prayed that the coon wouldn't jump out. Inching along, being as quiet as I could, I made it up to old Dan and grabbed his collar. I sat down on the limb and held him tight. He would bawl now and then, and all but burst my eardrums. I couldn't drop him to the ground, and I couldn't climb down with him. I couldn't sit there in the limb and hold him all night. I would be no better off than when daylight came. Glancing at the hole by my side gave me the solution to my problem. I thought, if he came out of this hole, he can go back in it. That was the way I got my dog down from the tree. This had its problems, too. In the first place, old Dan didn't want to be put in the hole head first. By scolding, pushing, shoving, and squeezing, I finally got him started on his way. Like a fool, I sat there on the limb waiting to see him come out the bottom, and come out he did. Turning around, bawling as he did, right back the hole he went. There was nothing I could do but sit and wait. I understood why his voice had stopped for a while. He just took a time out to climb the tree. Putting my ear to the hole, I could hear him coming. Grunting and clawing, up he came. I helped him out of the hole, turned him around, and crammed him back in. That time I wasn't too gentle with my work. I was tired of sitting on the limb, and my bare feet were getting cold. I started down the same time that he did. He beat me down. Looking over my shoulder, I saw him turn around and head back for the hole. I wasn't too far from the ground, so I let go. The flint rocks didn't feel too good to my feet when I landed. I jumped to the hole just in time to see the tip of his tail disappearing. I grabbed it, holding on with one hand. I worked his legs down with my other and pulled him on out. I stopped his tree climbing by cramming rocks and chunks into the hole. How the coon stayed in the tree, I'll never know, but he did. With a well-aimed rock, I scared him out. Old Dan satisfied his lust to kill. I started for home. I'd had all the hunting I wanted for that night. I had often wondered what old Dan would do if little Ann got into some kind of predicament. One night, I got my answer. For several days, a northern blizzard had been blowing. It was a bad one. The temperature dropped down to 10 below. The storm started with a slow, cold drizzle and then sleet. With the wind starting to blow, everything froze, leaving the ground as slick as glass. Trapped indoors, I was as nervous as a fish out of water. I told Mama I guessed it was just going to storm all winter. She laughed and said, "I don't think it will, but it does look like it'll be at least for a while." She roughed up my hair and kissed me between the eyes. This did rile me up. I didn't like to be kissed like that. It seemed that I could practically rub my skin off and still feel it, all wet and sticky, kind of burning. Sometime on the 5th night, the storm blew itself out and snowed about 3 inches. The next morning I went to my doghouse. Scraping the snow away from the two-way door, I stuck my head in. It was as warm as an oven. I got my face washed all over by little Ann. Old Dan's tail thumped to the tune of the wall. I told them to be ready because we were going hunting that night. I knew the old ringtails would be hungry and stirring, for they had been denned up during the storm. That evening I was leaving the house. Papa said, "Billy, be careful tonight. It's slick down there under the snow, and it would be easy to twist an ankle or break a leg." I told him I would and that I wasn't going far, just back of our fields into the bottoms. "Well, anyway," he said, "be careful. There'll be no moon tonight, and you're going to see some fog next to the river." Walking through our fields, I saw my father was right about it being slick and dark. Several times I slipped and sat down. I couldn't see anything beyond the glow of my lantern, but I wasn't worried. My light was a good one, and Mama had insisted that I make 2 little leather pouches to cover the blades of my axe. Just before I reached the timber, old Dan shook the snow from the underbrush with his deep voice. I stopped and listened. He bawled again. The deep bass tones rolled over and under the tall sycamores, tore their way out of the thick timber, traveled out over the fields, and slammed up against the foothills. There they seemed to break up and die away in the mountains. Little Dan was working the trail slowly, and I knew why. He would never line out until little Ann was running by his side. I thought she would never get there. When she did, her beautiful voice made the blood pound in my temples. I felt the excitement of the hunt as it ate away into my body. Taking a deep breath, I reared back and whooped as loud as I could. The coon ran upriver for a ways, and then, cutting out of the bottoms, he headed for the mountains. I stood and listened until their voices went out of hearing. Slipping and sliding, I started in the direction that I had last seen them. About halfway to the foothills, I heard them coming back. Somewhere in the rugged mountains, the coon had turned around and headed for the river. It was about time for him to play out a few tricks, and I was wondering what he was going to do. I knew it would be hard for him to hide his trail with snow on the ground, and I realized later that the smart old coon knew this too. As the voices of my dogs grew louder, I could tell that they were coming straight toward me. Once I started to blow out my lantern, thinking that maybe I could see them when they crossed our field. But I realized I didn't stand a chance of seeing the race in the skunk black night. Down out of the mountains they brought him, singing a hound dog song on his heels. The coon must have scented me or seen my lantern. He cut to my right and ran between our house and me. I heard screaming and yelling from my sisters. My father started whooping. I knew my whole family was out there on the porch listening to the beautiful voices of my little red hounds. I felt as tall as the tallest sycamore in the riverbank. I yelled as loud as I could. Again I heard the squealing of my sisters and the shouts of my father. The deep ow of old Dan and the sharp ow of little Ann bored a hole in the inky black night. The vibrations rolled and quivered in the icy silence. The coon was heading for the river. I could tell my dogs were crowding him and wondered if he was going to make it to the water. I was hoping he wouldn't, for I didn't want to wade through the cold water unless I really had to. I figured the smart old coon had a reason for turning and coming back to the river and wondered what trick he had in mind. I remembered something my grandfather had told me. He said, "Never underestimate the cunning of an old river coon. When the nights are dark and the ground is frozen and slick, they can pull some mean tricks on a hound. Sometimes the tricks can be fatal." I was halfway through the fog-covered bottoms when the voices of my dogs stopped. I stood still, waited, and listened. A cold silence settled over the bottoms. I could hear the snap and crack of sap-frozen limbs. From far back in the flinty hills, the long, lonesome howl of a timber wolf floated down in the silent night. Across the river I heard a cow moo. I knew the sound was coming from the Lowry place. Not being able to hear the voices of my dogs gave me an uncomfortable feeling. I whooped and waited for them to bawl. As I stood waiting, I realized something was different in the bottoms. Something was missing. I wasn't worried about my dogs. I figured that the coon had pulled some trick, and sooner or later they would unravel the trail. But the feeling that something was just not right had me worried. I whooped several times but still got no answer. Stumbling, slipping, and sliding, I started on. Reaching the river, I saw it was frozen over. I realized what my strange, uneasy feeling was. I had not been able to hear the sound of the water. As I stood listening, I heard a gurgling out of the middle of the stream. The river wasn't frozen all the way across. The still eddy waters next to the banks had frozen, but out in the middle, where the current was swift, the water was running, leaving a trough in the middle of the ice pack. The gurgling sound I had heard was the swift current as it sucked its way through the channel. The last time I had heard my dogs, they were downstream from me, so I walked on listening. I hadn't gone far when I heard old Dan. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. He wasn't bawling on a trail or giving the tree bark. It was one long, continuous cry. In his deep voice there seemed to be a pleading cry for help. Scared, worried, and with my heart beating like a churn dasher, I started toward the sound. I almost passed him, but with another cry he let me know where he was. He was out on the ice pack. I couldn't see him for the fog. I called to him, and he answered with a low whine. Again I called his name. This time he came to me. He wasn't the same dog. His tail was between his legs, and his head was bowed down. He stopped about 7 feet from me. Sitting down on the ice, he raised his head and howled the most mournful cry I've ever heard. Turning around, he trotted back on the ice and disappeared in the fog. I knew something had happened to little Anne. I called her name. She answered with a pleading cry. Although I couldn't see her, I had guessed what had happened. The coon had led them to the river. Running out on the ice, he had leaped across the trough. My dogs, hot on the trail, had followed. Old Dan, a more powerful dog than little Anne, had made his leap. Little Anne had not made it. Her small feet were probably slipped on the slick ice, and she had fallen into the icy waters. Old Dan, seeing the fate of his little friend, had quit the chase and came back to help her. The smart old coon had pulled his trick, and a deadly one it was. I had to do something. She would never be able to get out of the water by herself. It was only a matter of time before her body would be paralyzed by the freezing water. Laying my axe down, I held my lantern out in front of me and stepped out on the ice. It started cracking and popping. I jumped back to the bank. Although it was thick enough to hold the light weight of my dogs, it would never hold me. Little Anne started whining and begging for help. I went all to pieces and started crying. Something had to be done, and done quickly, or my little dog was going to be lost. I thought of running home for a rope for my father, but I knew she wouldn't last until I got back. I was desperate. It was impossible for me to swim in the freezing water. I wouldn't last for a minute. She cried again, begging for the one thing I couldn't give her, help. I thought, if only I could see her, maybe I could figure out a way to help. Looking at my lantern gave me an idea. I ran up the bank about 30 feet, turned, and looked back. I could see the light, not well, but enough for what I had in mind. I grabbed my lantern and my axe and ran for the bottoms. I was looking for a stand of wild cane. After what seemed like ages, I found it. With the longest one I could find, I hurried back. After it was trimmed and the limber end cut off, I hung the lantern by the handle on the end of it and started easing out on the ice. I saw old Dan first. He was sitting close to the edge of the trough, looking down. Then I saw her. I groaned at her plight. All I could see was her head and her small front paws. Her claws were spread out and digging into the ice. She knew that she was forever lost if she could not hold on. Old Dan raised his head and howled. Hound though he was, he knew it was the end of the trail for his little pal. I wanted to get my light as close to little Anne as I could, but my pole was a good 8 feet short. Setting the lantern down, I eased the pole from under the handle. I thought, I'm no better off than I was before. In fact, I'm worse off. Now I can see when the end comes. Little Anne cried again. I saw her claws slip on the ice. Her body settled lower in the water. Old Dan howled and started fidgeting. He knew the end was close. I didn't exactly know when I started out toward my dog. I had taken only 2 steps when the ice broke. I twisted my body and fell toward the bank. Just as my hand closed on a root, I thought my feet touched bottom, but I wasn't quite sure. As I pulled myself out, I felt the numbing cold creep over my legs. It looked so hopeless. There didn't seem to be any way that I could save her. At the edge of the water stood a large sycamore. I got behind it, anything to blot out the heartbeat-breaking scene. Little Anne, thinking I had deserted her, started crying. I just couldn't stand it. I opened my mouth to call old Dan. I wanted to tell him to come on, and that we'd go home and there'd be nothing we could do. The words just couldn't come out. I couldn't utter a sound. I lay my face against the icy cold bark of the sycamore. I thought of the prayer I had said when I had asked God to help me get my 2 hound pups. I knelt down and sobbed out a prayer. I asked for a miracle which would save the life of my dog. I promised all the things a young boy could if only he would help me. Still saying my prayer and making promises, I heard a sharp metallic sound. I jumped up and stepped away from the tree. I was sure the noise I heard was made by a rattling chain on the front end of a boat. I shouted as loud as I could, "Over here! I need help! My dog is drowning!" I waited for an answer. All I could hear were the cries of little Anne. Again I hollered, "Over here! Over on the bank! Can you see my light? I need help! Please hurry!" I held my breath, waiting for an answering shout. I shivered from the freezing cold of my wet shoes and overalls. A straining silence settled over the river. A feathery rustle swished by the blackness. A flock of low-flying ducks had been disturbed by my loud shouts. I strained my ears for some sound. Now and then I could hear the lapping slap of the ice-cold water as it swirled its way through the trough. I glanced to little Anne. She was still holding on, but I saw her paws were almost to the edge. I knew the time was short. I couldn't figure out what I had heard. The sound was made by metal striking metal, but what was it? What could have caused it? I looked at my axe. It couldn't have made that sound as it was too close to me. The noise had come out from the river. When I looked at my lantern, I knew that what had made the strange sound. I had left the handle standing straight up, and when I had taken the pole away, now it was down. For some unknown reason, the stiff wire handle had twisted in the sockets and dropped, as if it had fallen and it had struck the metal frame, making the sharp metallic sound that I heard. As I stared at the yellow glow of my light, the last bit of hope faded away. I closed my eyes, intending to pray again for the help I so desperately needed. Then, like a blinding red flash, the message of the lantern bored its way into my brain. There was my miracle. There was the way to save my little dog. In the metallic sound I had heard were my instructions. They were so plain I couldn't help but understand them. The bright yellow flame started flickering and dancing. It seemed to be saying, "Hurry, you know what to do." Faster than I'd ever moved in my life, I went to work. With a stick, I measured the water in the hole where my feet had broken through the ice. I was right. My foot had touched bottom. 18 inches down, I felt the soft mud. With my pole, I fished the lantern back to the bank. I took the handle off, straightened it out, and bent a hook in one end. With one of my shoelaces, I tied the wire to the end of the cane pole. I left the hook sticking out about 6 inches beyond the end of it. I started shouting encouragement to little Anne. I told her to hang on and not give up, for I was going to save her. She answered with a low cry. With the hook stuck in one of the ventilating holes of the top of my light, I lifted it back out of the ice and set it down. After a little wiggling and pushing, I worked the hook loose and laid the pole down. I took my clothes off, picked up my axe, and stepped down to the hole of the icy water. It came to my knees. Step by step, breaking the ice with my axe, I waded out. The water came up to my hips, then to my waist. The cold bite of it took my breath away. I felt my body grow numb. I couldn't feel my feet at all, but I knew they were moving. When the water reached my armpits, I stopped and worked my pole toward little Anne. Stretching my arms as far as I could, I saw I was still a foot short. Closing my eyes and gritting my teeth, I moved on. The water reached my chin. I was close enough. I started hooking at the collar of little Anne. Time after time, I felt the hook almost catch. I saw I was fishing on a wrong angle. She had settled so low in the water I couldn't reach her collar. Raising my arms above my head so that the pole would be on a slant, I kept hooking and praying. The seconds ticked by. I strained for one more inch. The muscles in my arms grew numb from the weight of the pole. Little Anne's claws slipped again. I thought she was gone. At the very edge of the ice, she caught again. All I could see now were her small red paws and her nose and eyes. By old Dan's actions, I could tell he understood and wanted to help. He ran over close to my pole and started digging at the ice. I whooped him with the cane. That was the only time in my life I ever hit my dog. I had to get him out of the way so that I could see what I was doing. Just when I thought my task was impossible, I felt the hook slide under the tough leather. It was none too soon. As gently as I could, I dragged her over the rim of the ice. At first I thought she was dead. She didn't move. Old Dan started whining and licking her face and ears. She moved her head. I started talking to her. She made an effort to stand but couldn't. Her muscles were paralyzed and the blood had long since ceased to flow. At the movement of little Anne, old Dan threw a fit. He started barking and jumping. His long red tail fanned the air. Still holding onto my pole, I tried to take a step backward. My feet wouldn't move. A cold, gripping fear came over me. I thought my legs were frozen. I made another effort to lift my leg. It moved. I realized that my feet were stuck in the soft, muddy bottom. I started backing out, dragging the body of my little Anne. I couldn't feel the pole in my hands. When the feet touched the icy bank, I couldn't feel that either. All the feeling in my body was gone. I wrapped little Anne in my coat and hurried into my clothes. With the pole, I fished my light back. Close by was a large drift. I climbed up on the top of it and dug a hole down through the ice and snow until I reached the dry limbs. I poured half of the oil in my lantern down into the hole and dropped in a match. In no time I had a roaring fire. I laid little Anne close to the warm heat and went to work. Old Dan washed her head with his warm red tongue while I massaged her and rubbed her body. I could tell by her cries when the blood started circulating. Little by little, her strength came back. I stood her on her feet and started walking her. She was weak and wobbly, but I knew she would live. I felt much better and breathed a sigh of relief. After drying myself out the best that I could, I took the lantern handle from the pole, bent it back to its original position, and put it back on the lantern. Holding the light out in front of me, I looked at it. The bright metal gleamed in the firelight glow. I started talking to it. I said, "Thanks, old lantern. More than you'll ever know. I'll always take care of you. Your globe will always be clean, and there will never be any rust or dirt on your frame." I knew if it had not been for the miracle of the lantern, my little dog would have met her death on that night. Her grave would have been the icy cold waters of the Illinois River. Out in the river I could hear the cold water gurgling in the icy trough. It seemed to be angry. It hissed and growled as it tore its way through the channel. I shuddered to think of what could have happened. Before I left for home, I walked back to the sycamore tree. Once again, I had a prayer. But this time the words were different. I didn't ask for a miracle. In every way a young boy could, I said thanks. My second prayer wasn't said with just words. All of my heart and soul was in it. On my way home, I decided to not say anything to my mother or father about little Anne's accident. I knew it would scare Mama and she might stop my hunting. Reaching our house, I didn't hang the lantern in its usual place. I took it to my room and set it in a corner with the handle standing up. The next morning, I started sneezing and came down with a terrible cold. I told Mama I'd gotten my feet wet. She scolded me a little and started doctoring me. For 3 days and nights I stayed home. All this time I kept checking the handle of my lantern. My sister shook the house from roof to floor with their playing and romping, but the handle never did fall. I went back to my mother and asked her if God answered prayers every time you said one. She smiled and said, "No, Billy, not every time. He only answers the ones that are said from the heart. You have to be sincere and believe in him." She wanted to know why I asked. I just said, just wondering. Just wanted to know. She came over and straightened my suspender, saying, "That was a very nice question for my little Daniel Boone to ask." Bending over, she started kissing me. I finally squirmed away from her, feeling as wet as a dirt dauber's nest. My mother never could kiss me like a fellow should be kissed. Before she was done, I was kissed all over. It always made me feel silly and baby-like. I tried to tell her that a coon hunter wasn't supposed to be kissed that way, but Mama never could understand things like that. I stomped out of the house to see how my dogs were. That was a long one, and I hope you enjoyed it. We'll pick up chapter 11 and the rest of them from there. Take care, guys.